Well, I'm very happy to welcome Dr. Chike Jeffers to African Philosophy Conversations today. Dr. Jeffers is at Dalhousie University in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada. He is associate professor there, and he holds a Canada Research Chair in Africana philosophy, which is pretty impressive, I have to say. And I guess I'd like to start by asking you a little bit about that Canada Research Chair. What is it, and why is it significant, and what do you plan to do with it?
Oh, thank you for having me, and thank you for celebrating the importance of the chair. I've officially held this chair. Well, it was announced in the spring of last year, and the Canada Research Chairs, as a general thing, is a federally funded sort of program that highlights important areas of research through supporting particular researchers. They pay for you to teach less, giving you the opportunity to research more. You have access to certain research funds, right? And so that's basically what it means. What it means to hold a Canada Research Chair. Dalhousie supported me in attaining a Canada Research Chair for myself, and it only made sense to call it the Canada Research Chair in Africana philosophy, because that definitely sums up what I'm interested in, what I do, what I seek to contribute as a person in philosophy. And so, to be honest, am still shaping it to some extent in terms of what exactly it'll mean. I mean, one thing to remember would be that, when I was thinking about what I could do with such a chair, initially, I didn't necessarily plan for, the pandemic, right? And so there's ways in which I envisioned, a lot of getting together for conferences. Is that going to really be the same? So, there are, of course, those kinds of questions. But the main things that I see as my task as Canada Research Chair in Africana philosophy would be to promote research into the history of Africana philosophy, which is something that, as you know, I already do in certain ways. For example, the podcast that I believe we'll be talking about shortly. I'm working on a book on W.E.B. Du Bois, and I have book projects. There's a book project that I eventually want to get around to that is on the negritude movement, and so there's my own work that way. There's the sort of collaborative stuff that I do want to do, whether it be conferences or not, right? Like I had an idea for a series of conferences or workshops on some early African American philosophers: David Walker, Maria Stewart, Jose Easton, Henry Highland Garnett. Anyway, I'm interested in how I can help to promote people getting a better sense of the tradition as we might delineate it. And of course, at this stage of research in Africana philosophy, how the tradition is delineated remains somewhat an open question. And so that's, what's exciting about doing the kind of work that I do. Also, I do think that an important aspect of the chair is promoting African Canadian philosophy. right? And that would already, in a sense, be part of the first task that I mentioned, because the question would be, when doing the history of Africana philosophy, how do African Canadians fit into that story? But beyond that, in terms of the idea of Africana philosophy, not just as a tradition, but rather as an ongoing area of contemporary research, right? Then it remains the case that African Canadian philosophy as an area of study is, it's complementary to call it in its beginning stages, right? Because there's just so much to be done for it to actually lift off in that sense. I mean, I am proud of an article that I published called "Do We Need African Canadian Philosophy?" That really was intended to push open those doors and invite especially young people of African descent who end up getting into philosophy, who are from Canada or live in Canada, right? I would like to think that, they now have this article at least to sort of make them think about what it means to do African Canadian philosophy. And so there's, various ways in which I hope to use the chair in promotion of that. I have actually been in touch with a student at, he's a PhD student in philosophy at the University of Toronto. And I've been talking with him about things like how we might even edit an anthology that would sort of be pushing things in this direction. And those, there's a lot of future plans that are still, in the works. But that's a little bit about what the chair is for.
Well, and that's a lot of, that's really exciting. And, my sense of the Canada Research Chairs is that they don't, they give them out for areas that are very cutting edge and very like future oriented, like the sort of thing which we have a commitment to try and develop. And, given how much of a profile Africana philosophy has had really both in Canada and the US and philosophy departments in general, which is to say not that much, I have to say it's really impressive that Dalhousie was willing to back something like this. And I'm very glad that you're in that position, but also that the Canada Research Chair exists at all in Africana philosophy. I think it's just really, really wonderful. And the kinds of things you're describing are I think exactly the kinds of things that we need to see. So I'm interested, let's back up a bit. I'm interested in how you got, both into philosophy in general and Africana philosophy in particular. Like you could have done anything. So why this?
So I went to York University in Toronto for my undergraduate degree, and I started in film. And so in terms of discovering that philosophy was my thing, that actually was to some extent, something that I had to figure out during undergrad. I was 2 years into my degree when I realized I didn't see myself going into the film industry. And I had, to some extent, already realized that I tended more towards the academic side of things. And so the initial switch that I made was actually not out of film, but from film production to film studies. But I do think in retrospect that the attraction to film studies was the attraction ultimately to theoretical thinking, to philosophy, right? And I've talked about it in certain other interviews that I've done. I mean, how one of the most important things that helped set me on my path was coming across a book in York University's bookstore, African American Philosophers, 17 Conversations, a book of interviews by George Yancey. And I had yeah, I had switched to film studies and I had added philosophy as a minor. I think even before I had taken a course in philosophy, but from the first course that I did in philosophy, I already knew that this was something that I really enjoyed. Um, and then that book by George Yancey really did a lot in terms of making me think about what it would mean to pursue a career in that. And so I do often use that book as a great example of the power of role models. Um, but there is another part of the story of that third year, or as I guess they would say in the US, the junior year, of my undergraduate degree. Um, and that would be that Esteve Morera, who's a philosopher in York's department and who does work on people like Gramsci and Vico, he happens to do enough reading in African philosophy to offer a course in it. And so I did take that course, and that also really helped me, so between that course that I was able to take in African philosophy, and as you point out, it's not that it is super common everywhere you go to be able to take a course in African philosophy. So I was fortunate to be at a place where someone had at least enough familiarity without even being someone who publishes in it, at least enough familiarity to offer the course. And so by taking that course and by also reading that book by George Yancey, those are really the two things that made me realize, actually, I think, philosophy is what I want to make my career in.
And you've gone from there to, work with people like Charles Mills and Suleiman Bashir Diagne. I mean, you've had some really great, people to work with over
I've been
time
very
as well.
fortunate,
Yeah, that's wonderful. Yeah. So that was your path. I mean, everyone has I guess their own path to finding this area, and the Canada Research Chair you have, and in your own work you use the term Africana philosophy. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, like what in your mind, what is encompassed by that term, what work does it do, like what does it make available to talk about that might not be available if you talked about African Canadian, African American, African Caribbean, African, as separate kinds of things.
Yeah. Yeah, and I can, connect that back to, those early days, so to speak, of my career, because by my last year, I was doing a directed reading again with Esteve, and certainly, in terms of what I was reading by that time, I was definitely trying to bring together, stuff that would be from both the continent and the diaspora, right? His course had focused on, African philosophy from the African continent. But, I was exposing myself to a lot of things that certainly, one way that I put it is that I didn't know the term Africana philosophy before undergrad, and before I think probably that third year of my undergrad. But upon learning about the term and upon seeing its usage, I think very swiftly became clear to me that, it was a term that basically described all that I was interested in. It wrapped up all that I was interested in, right? And so that, that is going to partly involve coming to philosophy with a prior sort of commitment to Pan-Africanism, through my upbringing, through my, understanding of the world and of politics and culture, right? So that's, part of what's going on there. It is interesting to say that, the term itself, we point this out in the first episode of the podcast, right? The term itself is not very old. Lucius Outlaw really seems to have been the first to promote it, And the first sort of well-recognized case of him using it is an article from the early 90s.
Mm.
And I was not yet a scholar, but I was alive. And then by the time that I'm in undergrad, you have Lewis Gordon, who's making use of it a lot.
Mm-hmm.
He put out a book called Existentia Africana,
Mm-hmm.
specifically addressed the use of that term,
Mm-hmm.
in that book. And his anthology Existence in Black, I think also makes use of that term. So I think that those two, not just those two, but those two particular philosophers in the American context, right, did a lot to promote use of the term, right? And just in case it's sort of unclear that I'm talking about it without having defined it, right? I mean, I define Africana philosophy as philosophy arising from and distinctively related to Africa and the African diaspora.
Mm-hmm.
And so, as Outlaw himself would often point out, it is an umbrella term. It covers not only African philosophy, but also African American philosophy, Afro-Caribbean philosophy, African Canadian philosophy.
Right. I mean, I'm interested in, there feels like a bit of a kind of internal tension in the term. It leans towards the idea of continuity across these different places.
Yes.
But it seems to be clear that African and African Caribbean and African American and all these different kinds of philosophical traditions are also responding to the conditions in their places, right? In other words, the conditions that they find before them. And so you get a kind of development of concepts and so forth that are also about speaking back to their lived conditions. So how do you navigate that tension between the kind of continuity that you see and also the the particular responses that people make to different kinds of conditions?
Maybe I don't think I would deny what you're calling attention there, but I think that, I think my first response would be that poses no special problem for the term Africana philosophy, right? That any term that classifies philosophy by relating it to a region or a specific people, let's just say that for now, a region or people, in some sense of the word people, right? Any such term is going to have to cover a certain variety, right? Especially if it's a term that applies over a span of time, right? And so you'll have very different conditions that people are responding to, as a result of that, right? And it is one interesting thing I mentioned, that a sense of commitment to Pan-Africanism would be something that helps make the term automatically make sense to me, right? But I think that something that I want to flag about that is that it is not the case, I think, that to recognize Africana philosophy as an area of study, let's say, necessarily prejudices one's view on a question like, is it important for people of different backgrounds who may be considered part of the African diaspora and the African continent? Is it important for them to work together? Is it important for them to see connections across cultural lines, right? So if we take Pan-Africanism to be to some extent a position advocating unity among the people of Africa and the African diaspora in various ways, politically, economically, culturally, and so on, right? That's a substantive position that I don't think one is given an answer to simply by recognizing that there are, there is a certain distinctive story we can tell about people living and thinking in the context of Africa and the African diaspora.
Yeah, great. And this in some ways kind of naturally segues us into the discussion of one of the big projects you've been involved in lately, which is the History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps podcast. That's Peter Adamson's podcast, which I don't know how many episodes he's up to. It's hundreds at this point. And the Africana philosophy subsection of it is already up to almost 100 episodes, I think, isn't it? Which is really an incredible achievement. And so talk me through a little bit about how that came to be and how you conceptualized it. I mean, what strikes me, and I've listened to a lot of the episodes. We're going to be listening to them in my class. I'm assigning students to listen to your episodes. And what strikes me is that you are picking out a lot of figures who I had barely a passing knowledge of, which is wonderful. I mean, you really get to learn a lot from this, but it strikes me like could be a never-ending task, right? I mean, there's, once you get one layer of people, you could go another layer, it seems to me. And the other thing that strikes me is that, for a very traditional Western philosopher, some of the people you talk about might not be recognizable as philosophers. You talk about sociologists, you talk about literary figures and political figures and so forth. And so I'm interested in how you made your choices, I guess, as to who to include. And yeah, I mean, I guess that's a bunch of questions, but I'll let you loose on talking about the podcast.
Yeah, I am very proud of my involvement with the podcast. It came about partly because I was a fan of the podcast. So as you have been acknowledging, there's a larger podcast, The History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps, by Peter Adamson, that this fits into, right? He, at a certain point, began to recognize that he should branch out beyond his initial plans. He initially, for example, had no plans to cover Indian philosophy or Chinese philosophy, and so on. There were some of us who, we loved almost everything about the podcast, but, it was hard for us to hear that it was going to be called The History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps and have content.
Huge gap. Right.
Yeah. I mean, he called it that because he was interested in the power of the podcast format to allow you to sort of go through a story without making certain big leaps. And so if you even just think about how Western philosophy is often taught, right? I mean, you often have cases where people are leaping from Aristotle to Descartes, right? And, if not all the way, Aristotle, maybe to Anselm, maybe to Aquinas, maybe to Descartes, things of that nature, right? And so he was interested in how, the podcast format, you don't have the end of the course coming, you can sort of just go at the pace you want. And it is, and it's tempting to say that what he was doing was the history of philosophy, the history of Western philosophy,
right?
Without any gaps. Although the slight difficulty there is that he himself is an expert in philosophy in the Islamic world, which many people would think of as non-Western philosophy. But part of what is going on there is that the history of philosophy in the Islamic world, one can fit it nicely and easily into a story that starts with philosophy in ancient Greece. Not to reduce it to only the ancient Greek component. And I think it's actually important that he doesn't do that himself.
Right.
But nevertheless, right, in terms of him thinking that he was going to tell some nice linear story, right? His area arguably of non-Western research, fit naturally into, him starting with the Thales in the first episode.
Right.
So in any case, he began to rethink that. I was among those listeners who was encouraging him in doing so. Right, the first fruits of his branching out was that he did a series of episodes co-written with Jonathan Ganeri on Indian philosophy. And I think maybe that had already gotten going, or was soon to get going. I don't remember exactly the timeline when, I suggested to him that if he wanted to talk about how it would work to cover Africa, that's something I could talk to him about, given my own expertise. We had a Skype conversation. This is back when Skype was used rather than Zoom, and as early as that, he was pretty sure that he wanted to cover this area and wanted to cover it with me. So, wanted to work with me the way that he did with Jonathan. So yeah, it's been pretty interesting. We have divided it into 3 parts. There was often a 3-part structure to some of the ways that he had done aspects, like even, for example, his part of the series on philosophy in the Islamic world. If you look at that, it's actually divided into 3 parts. So I was kind of used to him having this 3-part structure, and I think that influenced the way I planned out what we did.
Right.
And I should say that our work is very collaborative, but part of what his intention was in terms of reaching out to someone like Jonathan and to someone like me, is to sort of know where to go, right? And so the plan of what we're covering, right, that would sort of come all from me, whereas the actual doing in our case is pretty collaborative, because we sort of trade off who's doing the first draft of a script, and so at least half of the first draft of the script will actually be him, and we'll revise what the other starts with. And yeah, the first part of the podcast, the one that is the most relevant to your course, is called Locating and Debating Pre-Colonial African Philosophy.
Right.
And so, to some extent has that chronological sense of wanting to cover, pre-colonial African philosophy, right? But starting as early as we possibly can, because exploring the question of whether, we really should say that philosophy itself, it is invented in Africa, because philosophy is something that we as humans have always done during the time in which we've had the linguistic and conceptual capacities to do so, which points very directly to Africa being the birthplace of philosophy, But then we sort of go into a written history. So we talk about ancient Egypt, we talk about Ethiopia, we talk about sub-Saharan Islamic contexts, right? And after going through that history of written thought in the pre-colonial period, then we turn to the rich topic of philosophy and oral traditions, at which point we're certainly in part drawing on the work of contemporary African philosophers, philosophers in the 20th century especially, and on to this one, who are trying to retrieve philosophy in all contexts,
sage philosophy and that sort of thing.
Well, yeah, I mean, sage philosophy comes up in sort of the last part of that section of the podcast, because we've sort of gone through a bunch of topics. There's time, there's personhood, communalism, and so on, right? And then we sort of make a shift to talk about how African philosophy as a self-conscious discipline is African philosophy named as such,
Mm.
right, is a development of the 20th century, is a development resulting from Africans being trained in Western philosophical institutions, and that training leading them to ask these questions about where to find African philosophy in pre-colonial traditions, right? And so even though we are in a sense not in the pre-colonial period in the last bit of the podcast, nevertheless, precisely the question of pre-colonial African philosophy is still at the core there. So that's why it's called locating and debating pre-colonial African philosophy, right? So because we get into the challenge of Untonji, and others in terms of whether African philosophy can be located in oral tradition. And we do, cover sage philosophy as one of the sort of compromises with regards to how to understand that question. Right. And, just to briefly mention the other two. So the second part is called Slavery and the Creation of Diasporic African Philosophy, and focuses mainly on the 18th and 19th centuries. Right. And so it's the question is no longer pre-colonial African philosophy. The question at that point is, what is happening philosophically, with Africans and African descendants in the wake of slavery and colonialism. And I'll note that I like that title that we gave it. Like if you put diasporic African philosophy in quotation marks and search it, I think probably we are one of the only things that come up that comes up. And so it's interesting to sort of point out that even there we're sort of using a phrase that contains the African philosophy. Yeah. Right. But then it's specifically not about African philosophy on the continent. And I think there's something maybe innovative about that. Right. In any case, the simple way, as I said, is to say that it covers sort of the 18th and 19th centuries and philosophy in European languages. And then, the last section, which is what we are still unfolding and unfolding over quite a while, is Africana philosophy in the 20th century. Right. There's one very nice thing about the podcast that they also lead to books, right? He has a deal with Oxford University Press, and parts 1 and 2 of our series, we're actually in the process of revising that book so it can go out for review. So that book will be called Africana Philosophy from Ancient Egypt to the 19th Century. And then when we finish this long bit that we're doing on for part 3, then that book will be called Africana Philosophy in the 20th century.
Well, and I'm glad to hear it's going to also be in book form as well as podcast form. I think, these each have different, strengths, I suppose, these different formats. I'm interested in, and especially in your third section now. I've been interested in the flow back and forth, figures like Senghor. You haven't got to Fanon yet, but these are figures who, are important both on the continent of Africa and elsewhere. Fanon, comes from the Caribbean, but he's hugely important in Africa. Senghor, as part of Negritude, is talking to Aimé Césaire and Suzanne Césaire and Damas and all the rest of them. And so, it feels like your notion of Africana really kind of comes into its own when you've got these figures who really are very engaged. So it's not just, figures who are in their place, let's say in the Caribbean or wherever, and have, some sense of the origin story of Africa and the respect for Africa and all of that sort of thing, but they really are, focused on their local, or I guess more local sorts of questions. there are a bunch of figures who really are moving back and forth. And
Absolutely.
yeah,
Yeah,
so no, go ahead.
yeah, no, I think that's right. If it's becoming, even more obvious in the 20th century stuff, I think that um, the part two stuff, the 18th and 19th centuries, you already see it. You already see how
Mm,
there are certain figures who, you know, I mean, it makes sense to classify it as Africana philosophy, and that's really probably the most expressive,
right.
most apt, way to capture it. I mean, so, you've mentioned, Senghor and Césaire from the 20th century, and those are some of my favorite thinkers. But I'll just give two examples. One of my favorite thinkers from the 18th centuries, and one of my favorite thinkers from the 19th centuries
Mm,
that extend the point. So, Otoba, Kwabena Otoba Cugoano,
mhm,
who writes his thoughts and sentiments on the evil of slavery in
mhm,
1787,
mhm,
right? I mean, so there you have a figure who is coming from what we can call Fanti land, right?
mhm,
He's coming from West Africa, and specifically from the area where the Fanti people live, which is part of present-day Ghana.
mhm,
And so there's this African point of origin, but he's about 13 when
mm,
he is, taken to be enslaved in the Caribbean. So the Caribbean is now, this new place shaping him, right? But he actually is only there a few years before his owner takes him to England, and he gains his freedom in England, right? So and it's in England that he becomes literate, that he eventually writes this book, right? And so if we want to sort of like, you know, zoom in on place, because this is Afro-British philosophy, and there's nothing wrong with thinking of it as Afro-British, but um, you know, we've already noted that to understand him, you have to understand the African and
right,
Caribbean contexts.
right.
And the book is especially about the Caribbean
Mm,
context, and begins with him, giving a little bit of autobiographical detail
mm,
about his African um, background. And he, makes reference to other Black people who have written. Um, so one of the persons that he mentions is a guy called John Marrant. Um, and without going too in depth about John Marrant, that takes us to the North American context, and
mm,
he's thinking of Marrant as someone who precedes him in being a Black writer.
mhm, mhm,
It's extremely, I think, obvious at that
yeah,
point that Africana is the categorizing,
right,
is
right,
the best way to categorize him as a
right.
thinker. And then very quickly giving my other example, Edward Blyden from the 19th
Mm,
century. Edward Blyden is from St. Thomas, which is
mhm,
today part of the U.S. Virgin Islands, but at that time was part of the Danish Virgin Islands, right? So
mm,
we've got the Danish Caribbean, that's where he's from. As a young man, he moves to the U.S., but he doesn't stay there because he realizes that his dreams of post-secondary education there run into the problems of racism in the 1850s, right? And so he leaves for Liberia, right? And of course, the very founding of Liberia as a country, right, is a story that requires, telling the story of African people on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean, right? It's a country that is created for people returning from being enslaved, uh, or returning, we can even put that in quotation marks, right? It's created for ex-slaves, as a homeland in that sense. And he goes there. He spends, most of the rest of his life as a West African. Um, some of his time in Sierra Leone, actually, not just Liberia. Um, and he is massively influential on um, the West African intellectuals that come after him. right? But we can't somehow take out
Right.
the aspect of him being from the Caribbean,
Right.
and spending time in North America, not just the brief time where he went there for his education and then left, but he and Alexander Crummell,
Mhm.
and Alexander Crummell being someone who is an African American, born an African American, the two of them, do lecture tours in the United States promoting emigration to Liberia,
Mhm.
right? So again, it just is obvious that Africana captures the
Right.
sphere in
Right.
which he's moving and thinking.
Well, and what's fascinating to me about that is the kinds of concepts that can emerge from that kind of interchange and that kind of movement across those spaces. And even if we just think about kind of large scale concepts like justice, freedom, even race, even many of these other sorts of things, and we often think of those as singular sorts of things, when in fact there's so many subtleties and variations within those as to the space in which they're developed. I mean, just the notion of freedom itself, when we think about that from an African or Africana perspective, is just so different from the discourse within the liberal West or something like that about what freedom is, and yet we still use the word freedom in these cases, and so it tends to cover over those really rich differences. And so I think what you describe as this kind of movement back and forth really is trying to bring back that that kind of subtlety, which is so important for understanding what exactly we're talking about when we use a word like freedom or justice or whatever it is.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Well, I've kept you on a good long time here, but I want to finish off by just getting you to talk a little bit about how you draw students into Africana philosophy, like what you have a nice big pulpit to draw people in, and is there anything you give them to read? Is there anything you talk to them about to kind of get them interested in Africana philosophy?
Well, I mean, I teach a course called Philosophy in the Black Experience, which is an introduction to Africana philosophy, and there's some similarities broadly to the podcast, right? So just as one of the early things that we touch on in the podcast is ancient Egyptian thought. Usually the first reading in my course is the instruction of Ptahhotep, right? And I really do think that the philosophical richness of the ancient Egyptian tradition is requires so much more attention. I mean, it remains a long-term goal of mine to actually be able to read and to therefore be able to, I've published stuff on ancient Egyptian philosophy, simply because I thought, that I shouldn't wait before I gained that better research capacity through being able to read forms of the ancient Egyptian language to sort of get the ball rolling. But of course, I'd like to push forward that research by having that ability. So yeah, really, there's, I think, great ancient Egyptian stuff. One of the things that I also introduced to the student in that class is the Ifa tradition of the Yoruba people, of West Africa, especially Nigeria, right? Because what you have, in that divination tradition is the use of verses, and these verses often have very interesting ethical components, and so that's an interesting way. And we do Zara Yaakov and Walter Hewett, 17th century Ethiopian philosophy, right? And then from there, I take them to Kuguano, and we read basically all of Kuguano's book. So that sort of shows the kind of historical approach that I do
Right.
take to the field in terms of starting to expose students to these various roots, and yeah, ROOTS and ROUTES
Right.
of Africana philosophy.
Right. Right. That's great. Well, thank you so much for taking some time out to chat with me. This has been Dr. Chike Jeffers from the Department of Philosophy at Dalhousie University. And I look forward to the next installments of the podcast and of your publications themselves.
Thank you so much.
You bet.